You are listening to WCAT Radio, your station for quality Catholic programming. Your selected program will begin right after a word from our sponsor, GroupM7.com, a web design and hosting company. Log on to GroupM7.com today and let them know that WCAT Radio sent you.
You know, my finest childhood memories was the Saturday morning movies. For about 4 bits each, my brother and I could split a Coke and a big box of popcorn and watch movies about Tarzan, Jane, and their Amazon River adventures. Well, maybe that's where Jeff Bezos took his name. His Amazon.com is now the largest online retailer in the world. I'm Michael Malfood with Group M7, the oldest and largest website design firm in East Texas. And here's my point, and as usual, it's a good one. If your website is modern and up-to-date, mobile and search engine friendly, it matters not whether you sell a product or provide information about your goods and services, your sales justifiably will increase just like theirs. The world uses the internet. We can improve your website and your email. Look at our giant portfolio at GroupM7.com. Since 1995, there's only one web and there's only one group, and it's us. It's Group M7.
You're listening to WCAT Radio, your home for authentic Catholic programming.
Hello, everybody. Deacon Al Bielawski here with another edition of Catholic Mysticism, where we talk about the supernatural aspects of our faith, relevant topics, the saints, and all things Catholic. And as we begin the show today, I just... a little sobering way we begin, even though we're going to talk about an incredible blessed and an incredible time during the Catholic Church in Mexico. Perhaps you saw the movie For Greater Glory, which was about the Cristero War, and very well done film. Hope it piqued your interest. We're going to talk about that a little later because I'm going to segue this into our show by saying, whether you're a believer that's listening to the show or a non-believer right now, I think we can all agree that there is an effort, and we can't hide it any longer, that there seems to be a movement to replace faith, especially the Christian faith, with a new religion based on secularism and relativism and humanism. It's not new. It's been around for a long, long time, gained a lot of strength during the Enlightenment, and basically, historically, has led to very difficult times, a lot of carnage, a lot of death for human beings. And basically, society and those in power seek to remove God from the picture and become their own God, to remove God's truths and replace it with their own truths based on whoever happens to be in power and what they tell us is truth. And this, as we can see, is playing out not only in the United States of America. And this is what I want to say, especially for those who are not believers. I just want you, for the sake of argument, to think for a moment and look at this from a supernatural standpoint. Because if you do, you're going to start being able to connect some dots, and things that don't make sense are going to start becoming much more clear. Throughout the world, we see this grab for power. And the COVID-19 pandemic was a good reason for people in power to, as you've probably heard the saying, don't let a good crisis go to waste by some political parties, that for some are using this for their advantage. And we see now that there seems to be a movement which is spiritual, because this is orchestrated through human beings, but it's so big, so worldwide, so intricate, that it is demonic in scope, and therefore must be led by Satan and his demons. Now I know, oh boy, Satan and his demons, here we go. But again, look at this from the supernatural aspect, and we'll start to make sense. Because there's much evil being done throughout the world, whether it makes the media or not. Christians that are giving up their lives for their faith, Muslims that are being put into prison camps in China, religious liberty being squelched in countries. We'll see now what happens in Afghanistan. And communism seeming and socialism to have gained again a foothold in the youth that it can be done right this time. So we see all these things happening. You see these protests in France and Australia and smaller countries like Belgium, and even in New York City just this last week, about a vaccine passport and people in power trying to force people to go against their choice. So you can see there's a pushback now. People are starting to push back. Parents are starting to push back against the education system and some of the programs. So you're seeing this groundswell. And we don't know where this is going to go. But when we see these things in the media, and we're continuously bombarded by them, it has opened this door to many people to live their lives in a state of fear. And here's the good news, again, from a spiritual perspective. There are many things that we can overcome. Illness, financial disasters, setbacks in our dreams, many things that are hard for us, a heavy cross, but we can overcome them. Now, death is a little different because 100% all of us are going to pass. And this is from the supernatural point. In Jesus Christ, who is Christians, as Catholic Christians, we believe rose from the dead, did something then. He did overcome death. And those things I mentioned, financial setbacks, illnesses, we can overcome those. And Jesus overcomes death for us because we can't overcome death. But there's something more important here at stake. Because while death can be overcome by Jesus, there is far something worse than death, and that's eternal damnation. And see, Jesus, through his cross and his blood, gives us the ability, if we follow him, if we try to live by his law, that we can overcome even that and be with him in paradise. Because at the end of time, whether we believe it or not, whether we want to live our lives as we believe it or not, we will die, we will be judged, and we will live again. And the question is where. So there is something worse than all this, again, being doomed to hell, but we can overcome that through the grace and the victory of Christ on the cross. And it's a good idea, to try and live our lives like that. And then when you look at this and pray for discernment and knowledge, some good things happen. You'll be able to have some good wisdom and be able to perceive not from a base of fear, but a base that Jesus has overcome all the anxiety and problems we have in this world, including death. And that gives us a different perspective, an ability to walk things back, take a breath, and look at them from an eye of eternity. And it makes all the difference in our lives, brothers and sisters. So don't be afraid. I want to make that point clear of all the things going on. Remember that Christ is the victor, and those that follow him will also share in that victory. So please, if you're not a follower, be open. Be open to God. Try to talk to God. See where it goes. And let him lead you to a joy and peace that you just can't believe until you become a follower of his. Okay. That being said, so let's dispense with the fear. Let's stand up for what's right. Let's stand up for God because, very quickly, these times, even though there's a lot of fear, this is, I believe, an adventurous and exciting time to be alive with much opportunity. Because you were put, think about this, The God of all creation knew from the beginning of time that he would put you to be born and live in this time, in these tumultuous times. And that is to be a fighter, to stand up for him and his church, and to help win souls to him. So this is an incredible, exciting time. So try to look at that from that perspective. Okay, so now let's talk about what happened in Mexico in the 20s, because it's part of our human condition to take things for granted. And, we certainly do that in this country with our religious liberty. It's something that we think will always be here. And basically for us and for many, couple generations, didn't cost anything. There wasn't a lot of sacrifice. Faith was just accepted. Confessionals were packed. The churches were packed. There were many priests, many religious, many vocations. Hollywood portrayed religion and the faith as a good thing. But history doesn't bear this out, that freedom of religion comes without a cost. It's just the opposite. For many countries and many cultures and many people, from the beginning of Christianity right up to this century now, religious freedom has come with popes and priests and nuns and all kinds of people paying the ultimate price to preserve it. And this program is going to be about specifically a Jesuit priest who paid the ultimate price during that time of the Cristero's War that we're going to talk about. And this is Blessed Miguel Pro. Now, let me just explain something, because some of the programs we've already done are saints, and the difference between a saint and a blessed. When a cause is first taken up for these people that are looked at by the church as holy, they are called a servant of God. So the individual's life is reviewed, and if it's clear, after much research and much prayer and discernment, that they lived a life of heroic virtue, they are given the title venerable. Next, when a miracle is able to be attributed to the intercession of that person, it is seen as they are a confirmation that they are in heaven, and they are named blessed. So the miracle, of course, comes through the grace of God who performs the miracle. But the intercession of a particular person that prayed to that blessed, that are venerable rather, and the miracle took place through the intercession, asking Jesus on that person's behalf, say for a miraculous healing, he is then named blessed. Then if a second miracle is attributed to that same person, then they are given the title saint, in which then they are seen as someone to hold up as a witness for the universal church, since they are in heaven. But before we begin to look at Father Miguel's story, we need to look at a little background, because one thing I think is very interesting, this isn't something that happened, I mentioned persecution has happened since the very beginning of Christianity, but it is recent in our modern times, because this took place during our decade of what we know and through history as the Roaring Twenties. And we look at that and see during this period of time, it was after World War I, the war to end all wars, right? And there were great technological advances. Babe Ruth was going to hit his 60 home runs that year. Jack Dempsey, during this time, was heavyweight champ. Talking pictures came into vogue. And Elliot Ness and the Untouchables were going to try and take down Al Capone. But south of the border, there was a war taking place. And it was a war for religious freedom. And this was known as it became the Cristero's War, or rebellion, where a government tried violently to destroy the Catholic Church and the religious liberty of the Mexican people. A war in which a ragtag band of rural Catholics, severely unarmed, with the cry of Viva Cristo Rey, which meant Long live Christ the King. And then one in the rebellion would cry, Que viva, he lives. And that would be their battle cry. And they would eventually defeat this evil persecution, which would claim over 200,000 combatants and civilians, with many more having to flee the country. Now, one of these heroes during the Cristero's rebellion was born to parents Don Miguel Pro and his wife Josefa. Now, Don Miguel worked actually for the government as a mining engineer, and therefore they had a very comfortable lifestyle, and they were secure during this time under President Porfirio Diaz. Now, he was a dictator, but he allowed religious liberty, and in all fairness, a great deal of progress was made in Mexico under him, and many things, the economy came back, there were bridges built. In that time, there was great technology for Mexico. And despite he could be ruthless at times, he did let religion go by. So it was this, tenuous agreement, but Mexico thrived, and there weren't that many problems yet, but they were coming. Now, young Miguel showed an actor's talent at a very age. He would entertain his brothers and sisters, and he performed as an actor with a puppet set that his father brought him. And he also mimicked and was known to be a great practical joker. And he quickly learned to play the guitar and mandolin, and later he and his siblings would actually form a string quartet. Now, Miguel's education was pretty simple and straightforward, as many of the people at that time. But it was interrupted because his father's work for the company caused them having to move frequently. So at one time, Miguel was homeschooled, and at one time he even went to a boarding school. So he flip-flopped back and forth here. But despite that interruption in his education, he gained very valuable life experience working in his father's office, actually as this young guy, doing payroll and organizing files. He was just a kid. He also, firsthand, and this is something that would remain with him all his life, he would see the terrible working conditions of the miners. And yet, even though his father was with the state and the company, his mother also and Dad showed great compassion to these miners and cared for them and stuck up for them and tried to make things bearable and do the best by them for their employees. But things started to get out of hand. And there was another painful image that became indelible to the young Miguel. You see, in 1907, a riot took place. The miners had it. And even though the father and mom had been so good to them, they were still part of the government. So they surrounded his father's office, despite the compassion. And the dreaded rurales had to be called out. And they came to town, and they ended that riot quickly, with many innocent workers being killed, a sight which Miguel actually witnessed peering through the windows of his father's office. And as this riot was being smothered by the troops, he prayed to God that he would not have a girlfriend for a year if his family was saved from the riot, which they were. And Miguel, being very human and very young, later broke the promise, telling God, "Pardon me, Lord, I didn't know what I was doing." So he kind of reneged on that promise. Now, two of Miguel Pro's sisters became nuns, and during a Jesuit retreat at the age of 20, he actually decided to enter the Jesuits. Now, while training in the town of Elano, he became one of the more popular classmates because of his comic personality. But you see, despite this and drawing others to him, there was a very serious side of Miguel Pro, especially when it came to prayer. They would watch him and see how devout he was in his prayer. Now, outside of these peaceful walls, where he was training in Elano, though, Mexico was falling apart. Now, we're going to get to this in a second. I want to put this into context because of these years. When these things came into vogue, I want to go back to Fatima for a moment. Because Mary Warren the Seer, St. Jacinta, St. Francisco, and Sister Lucia, by the way, they're looking at her cause now to become a saint. We're told by the Blessed Virgin Mary that if things were not done, if conditions were not met, that men and women would not repent and they would not pray the rosary, a greater war would break out, that communism through Russia would spread her evil ways. Well, during this time in 1917 of that apparition of Fatima, remember shortly after, in October, after that famous miracle of the sun in October, Fatima, Lenin's revolution in Russia took place. And all things came to be that the Virgin Mary said. And it became a very tumultuous time with the communists believing it was their time for worldwide domination, and a lot of things happened. So what was happening in Mexico, though, was also part of this seed that had been planted in communist Russia. Because, again, there was this movement to destroy the Catholic Church. And Mexico, at this time, there were 4 warring generals fighting for the control of the country. So Miguel's family, as well as others, was deeply affected, and they fled their home. And not only was it a difficult time for the country to begin with, but soon enough, times became hard for the church. So hard, in fact, that in that town of El Llano, preparations were made for the novitiates to have to flee. So disguises were gathered to dress as lay people, and anything that have identified them as priests and study would have to be left behind. The plan was to hide out in nearby Zamora, another village, in the people's homes and haciendas until they could resume their studies. Now, one of the warring generals, General Carranza, came to power. So what happened was he started a relentless anti-clerical attack, and churches were closed in Zamora, and all priests were ordered to report to him, where once they did, they were immediately put into prison. So no Catholic at this time was safe. So all the novices, including Miguel Pro, were ordered to report to Guadalajara, where Miguel was reunited with his family, and he was stunned because, boy, had their living conditions changed. Remember, they had security and a comfortable lifestyle. But because of what was going on, he found that his father had been safely hidden, but that he was not with his mother and family. So his mother was forced to eke out a living, and she didn't even know where her husband was, only that she had heard he was safely hidden. And this was a far cry from what Miguel knew as a child. But they never complained. And finally, after all this hiding out and watching what they were doing, word came to Miguel and his classmates they would be going to Northern California to resume their studies. Now, while their American counterparts welcomed them, there was a problem at this study. For Spanish books and materials they didn't have them, where they were finally sent to learn. And while they were hoping things would get better in Mexico, they struggled in their studies because of this lack of Spanish. So it was doubly hard on them. And plus they had that great weight, that pendulum swinging back and forth, that their homeland was in dire trouble. And sure enough, word began to come back that there were more civilian deaths and atrocities taking place during the Civil War. And because of this, it was now decided once again, Miguel and his seminarians would have to be sent to Granada in Spain to complete their studies. This is how bad it was getting in Mexico. So you can imagine, or maybe it's hard for us to imagine actually, trying to study, trying to become a priest, to become a servant of God, and being put on hold and bounced here and bounced there, and just not knowing what would happen, and all the weight of worrying about their families and what was happening in Mexico. Now, in 1920, and this is the 5th year of study for Miguel and his classmates, they had completed. So, part of the program was that they would have to do missionary work. And Miguel was sent to Nicaragua for 2 years to gain pastoral experience. And then he was finally sent to Belgium, where finally, on August 31st, 1925, at 34 years of age, remember, he had this calling at 20, he became ordained. Now, while Miguel was overjoyed at becoming a priest, he had to carry his crosses. I mentioned he worried about the condition of his family and their living conditions, and this haunted Miguel. And then, just a year later, in February of 1926, Miguel lost his beloved mother. And in addition to these crosses, he also suffered from poor health, at one time having to have 3 surgeries to correct an ailment which did not help. And he suffered from insomnia. And despite all this, Miguel volunteered to help the coal miners in Belgium, often donning work clothes and working with them. Because he worked around socialists and communists, they thought, you know what, this guy's going to be terrified of us. And at first they gave him a hard time. But when they realized he wasn't afraid of them and would converse with them and challenge what they believed, they asked us, why aren't you afraid of us? Others were. And he told them, well, I have been armed with a crucifix. I don't fear you. Now, eventually, Miguel was called back to his homeland in Mexico, and he had a choice to go, which he chose to do that. And in the eyes of many, this was a big mistake. He was going into the lion's den against a powerful enemy who wanted nothing less than to complete, once and for all, the destruction of the Catholic Church in Mexico. And his name was President Elias Calles. Now, Calles sought to eliminate the power of the church and all organizations affiliated with it, as well as suppress the religious celebrations, which the people of Mexico dearly loved. And in turn, what he tried to do is enact a law known as the Calles Law. This law provided specific penalties for priests and individuals who violated the Article 130 of the Mexico Constitution that was basically separating church from state. Priests, for example, couldn't wear their clerical clothes or criticize the government without severe penalties. Now, just a sidebar on this. We see that there were some people that fled that were clerics, Mexico, and others like Miguel Pro that went and stayed. You'll always have this. And not judging people, this is the way we are as human beings. This is what I meant by we have these human weaknesses, these human tendencies. Some rise during tumultuous times to heroic movements, and others don't. They play it safe. They try to do work for God in a safer atmosphere, and others are throwing right into the maelstrom. So we don't judge these people. Each has his place, but this is the heroic courage which we need to pray for during our tumultuous times, that we will stand fast. Now, Mexico's Constitution separated that church from state. And our founding fathers, specifically Thomas Jefferson, that's church and state. I won't get into this too long. You can check this out. Basically, that started in Connecticut when a Baptist minister was concerned that the government, this newly formed government in the United States, would force a religion on every person. And Jefferson wrote to him to say, no, we have freedom here. That's what the separation of church and state was, is that it still is, that the government will not force any particular religion on a person. It doesn't mean that all things religiously or anything theologically should be stripped from the government. And that's what we've done, and that's why we're running and will continue to have problems. And if you want to check to back that up, check Jefferson's letter to the Virginia Commonwealth and see what he had to say about religion and some of the writings of the Founding Fathers and how it was indispensable with the morality of this country to succeed. So we've taken and used, in a way, as the Mexico Caius president did, to use this as a lever to try and get a certain agenda pushed, even though that is not what, at least in this country, the separation of church and state was designed for. Anyway, you can check that out. All right. So to help enforce the law, Caius, what he did was he began to seize the church property. And then any priest that was from a foreign country was immediately expelled. He then closed monasteries, convents, and religious schools. And this law was a very big reason the uprising took place. Now, for the people, they were basically uneducated, basically simple, loving folks that loved their God, and they loved their church, and they loved their priests. So when they saw their priests being removed, they saw their priests being arrested, this was a direct affront, because this they could understand. Father such and such is being taken from us. And that finally led to this Cristero's War, because there had been several uprisings. And while the Mexican government and the world thought nothing of them, it was a big joke, you see, these peasants were starting to begin to become powerful, and their faith sustained them, and they begin to get and win these skirmishes and get armament from these victories. And at one time, when a general, well-known general, was killed and his regiment was wiped out, people began to realize, oh my gosh, this is for real. These people are for real. Because these Catholic peasants had had enough. They would come and fight for their God and church. And right in the mix of this now would be one of the government's worst enemies, and that was Father Miguel Pro. Now, Father Miguel did not pick up a weapon and join the rebels and fight side by side with them. But he served in a different capacity. I just want to go back, because one of the things that happened with this Caius law is there was a given date, and the bishops were so afraid of what was happening that they realized we are going to have to suspend masses, baptisms, confessions, weddings, everything. You know, sort of like we've got some familiarity with that with what? The pandemic. We'll talk about that later. But so they gave a date, and due to the peasants, they agreed with this. They agreed that the bishops should do this because of things were getting so bad. And one bishop, in the day that the last day before the churches would close for good, baptized 3,000, and he had to literally be carried off because he just became too weak. That's the kind of heroic action that we'll see, you know, during these tumultuous times. Like I said, even from us, if things get worse, and we don't know where things are going now, during these times we are living in. But anyway, in July 1926, Caius ordered all the priests to register with the government, and the bishops, again, had to decide to suspend the worship of the country, and that would be July 3rd. And, of course, you can imagine the panic and the chaos that followed by the people. And a matter of fact, speaking of collapsing, Father Miguel heard so many daily confessions that he, like that bishop, also collapsed. So when the deadline came, Father as well as others went underground. And they began celebrating masses and giving communion in what were known as secret places known as communion stations. And you'll remember I said he was an actor, and he played this to the hilt. You know, he used to use an array of disguises, this man. He would sometimes dress as a policeman, other times government officials. He'd dress a mechanic and a student. One time, he gave a secret retreat to 80 state workers in the state offices, and they took great pleasure in that they were praying the rosary during this retreat in these government offices that were so intent on destroying them. He also helped many, many poor families of the peasants during the war. Because, during this war, they not only had to fight and with their limited resources, but they also had to endure many times of no food to eat, no water, no clean clothes, and just horrible living conditions. And they did this all for their love of the faith. He also found foster homes for the abandoned babies during this Cristero's war, and many babies would be left at his doorstep. As a matter of fact, his family ended up adopting one. Now, it's interesting because Father Miguel was always ready to accept the crown of martyrdom and talked of being able to draw, and I quote, that lucky number. And that lucky number would come up through a botched assassination attempt which he had no part in. You see, Callas' predecessor, this Alvaro Obregon, was driving to a bullfight. He loved the bullfights in his Cadillac. And all of a sudden the car speeded up toward him. It hurled two homemade bombs into the car. But he was unarmed. And the assassins were followed, and they were apprehended after a shootout. Now, one was Luis Vilches, a friend of Father Pro. And at first, Vilches denied any knowledge. Matter of fact, he was very clever. Before the assassination attempt, he purchased a ticket to that same bullfight that Obregon was going. Matter of fact, he arranged a meeting purposely so he would have an alibi established. So, of course, when he pointed all these things out after being questioned, he was released. But Father Miguel and his two brothers were arrested. Now, Father Pro was well known for his help of the Cristero's families and being an unspoken critic of Caius and the government. So he was on their wanted list. His brother, Humberto, was also known to be associated for distributing propaganda and participating in activities against the government. And Father's other brother, Roberto, was actually sold the car that was used in the assassination attempt 3 days before, and that's what got them in trouble. Because that car from 3 days ago was still registered to him, and it didn't look good. So they were arrested on these charges, even though he had sold the car, and the car that was used. Now, when Luis Vilches heard that they had been arrested, he went to the police, and he told them that the Pros were innocent, and he confessed to the crime. But you see, the police at that time, the government at that time, had their enemy, and they had their excuse, and they had the reason to send Pro and his brothers to trial, even though these were known trumped-up charges, and that's what they did. And the charges were so ludicrous, in fact, that the Pros thought they would be released and didn't really take this too seriously. But this wasn't to happen. They were too big a thorn in the side of Caius, and he had other ideas. So he would put them in trial, and they would, of course, be found guilty in a make-believe trial. So he invited photographers from all over to witness these upstarts' execution, and it would gain him sympathy once the people saw what this Catholic Church and his priests were doing, and would show the world what the Church was capable of. So on November 23rd, 1927, Father Pro, his brothers Humberto and Roberto, and Luis Vilches were led out in the courtyard to be shot. Now, Father Miguel bravely knelt down, and he prayed for 2 minutes. He then stood bolt upright and held his arms out in the form of a cross, holding a crucifix in one hand and a rosary in the other, and forgave his enemies. Viva Cristo Rey were his last words as the bullets came flying at them. Blessed Miguel Pro, his brother Humberto, and Luis were also killed. But interestingly enough, Roberto was spared, but later had to fled to Cuba. Now, later that evening, Father Pro's broken-hearted father claimed his body at the morgue. What suffering he had to go through, huh? Lost his wife, his livelihood, and 2 sons. Later that evening, the crowds, despite the government, formed in the thousands to pay their respects to this wonderful priest whom they loved. They defied the government with as many as 20,000 people attending the funeral the next day. And as far as Caius's plan to use the photographs for sympathy, it backfired on him tremendously. You know, you can see some of these photographs on the internet, and there is some video of the actual execution. You know, when these photographs came out, people worldwide were outraged. And the U.S. finally got involved and sent their ambassador, Dwight Morrow, to Mexico to broker a deal for peace. And with pressure mounting from the Vatican, from other governments outside of Mexico, especially the U.S., the Knights of Columbus, who helped with the Cristeros in their quest for religious freedom, they were a big factor in their victory. The Cristeros War finally came to an end, and the Mexican people triumphed over evil and won their religious freedom. And Miguel Pro was beatified by St. John Paul II, September 25th, 1988. So, how is this relevant for us today? Well, I mentioned this climate of fear, a climate of disunity. I just saw where some historian now, something we've talked about on the show, has agreed that this is probably, as for the United States, the most polarized it's been since the Civil War. And that would be the famous Ken Burns, who's done those great documentaries, and gave a warning at a talk he was giving that we need to turn this around. Oh, wholeheartedly agree with that. But there is this worldwide disunity now, and there's pushback against the powers that be. So we don't learn from history and the past mistakes that people that have lived before us have made. And again, it is so easy to take our religious freedom and mistake that it will always be here without any cost. Now, I mentioned, we get back to that, during the pandemic, we saw just how quick things were shut down. Eucharist taken away, confession, masses. People were hungry at a time they desperately needed this. So we see how quick things can change on a dime. And we've got to realize, in this supernatural war for souls, there will always be evil forces that try to destroy our dignity as children of God. And our human history bears this out around the globe. You can't deny this. But God will always prevail, as he did in the Cristeros rebellion, when priests and nuns and laity put their lives on the line to bring Jesus to others. Despite overwhelming odds, these countless men and women of Mexico, despite this opposition, enduring unimaginable hardships, with a belief in God and their Catholic Church that was never broken, they triumphed. Because they believed they were doing what was right, following God and his laws. And they were on the right side of history, the right side of faith. And this is our lesson, that we have to endure, to persevere, to stand up for our God and our church and religious liberty no matter what the cost. Because remember, there is something worse than even death, and that's final damnation, which Jesus has given us through his grace the ability to be with him and not have that happen to us. So we can learn from Blessed Miguel Pro, those Cristeros martyrs who gave their lives, those families and the innocent that gave their lives, because they knew something. There is something greater than our problems here in life, than our fears here in life, than our very lives here. That they were willing to pay this ultimate sacrifice. You see, they knew that if you do not stand for something, you will fall for anything. Blessed Miguel Pro, pray for us for discernment, that we will see God's hand in everything happening in our time today, and that through the grace of God, He will use our priests, our religious, our bishops, and our laity to stand firm for Him, His church, and conquer any evil, any designs that Satan has, and bring about that peace and justice which we all seek around the globe through Christ our Lord. Viva Cristo Rey. Que viva. God bless and good night.
Hello, God's beloved. I'm Annabelle Mosley, author, professor of theology, and host of Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. I invite you to listen in and find inspiration along this sacred journey we're traveling together to make our lives a masterpiece and, with God's grace, become saints. Join me, Annabelle Mosley, for Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. God bless you. Remember, you're never alone. God is always with you.
Thank you for listening to a production of WCAT Radio. Please join us in our mission of evangelization. And don't forget, love lifts up when knowledge takes flight.